There is a famous saying that goes like this: there are no atheists in foxholes or at funerals. And my thought was that Regina Spektor must have had that quote in mind when she penned this song. Although listening to an interview of her on CBC's Q from a couple months ago, she spoke of, quote, not really trying to provide answers in her songs or all that clear a message in her music. She's really quite the artist that sort of waits for things to show up and just sort of puts them down in her quizzical, she admits somewhat cynical and skeptical way. So maybe she's not heard of that famous aphorism. Maybe it's just one of those truths that are just true about who we are as human beings. We can't help but notice that our expressions of faith often play out in the way that she's penned. People search for God when they're in trouble. In a hospital, in a war, freezing, poor, when the doctor calls after some routine tests, when their kids aren't home yet, when the police knock at the door. And you can hardly fault us, any of us, for doing that, can you? I mean, where else do you go when your plane is shaking uncontrollably? Who else do you call when something totally out of the blue and out of control is causing your life to fall apart? And yet, in the famous saying and in the song, as you listen to it, there's this subtle underlying word of indictment about that fact about us. In that foxhole and funeral home aphorism, isn't there? I listen to it and I get this sense of, and when I see people, sort of reach out to God in moments of brokenness, sometimes I think, yeah, sure, now you have faith. Now you come to God. When I first listened to the song and loved it, and then it got to the end where she sort of twists it and says, now we're all laughing with God, I'm pretty innocent, so I just pictured all of us with God and we're all happy and joyful. My wife just went, and was taken aback by what she thought was this artist saying that God kind of laughs at us in our foolishness and folly and futility. Does God laugh at us? Derisively or mockingly? I don't think so. Don't think there's a biblical mandate for that worldview. So maybe Regina's mockingly laughing at God with a line like that. Regardless, she makes a good point about how we, me, us, how we can live our faith so based on circumstance. When times are tough, we turn to God, but when times are good, even though we still believe in God and we know God is God and we haven't changed anything in terms of what we know, we don't turn to God. We ignore God. We trade the glory of God in so that we can be gods for a while. And we get totally lost. We end up turning away and face God with our backs and backsides and ignore Him because we want to be God. We're laughing at Him. And we all do this. You do this. I do this all the time. I know that I do it all the time because time after time after time, I have these experiences where I feel I'm turning back to God again. And in the turning back, I'm indicting myself. In his letter to the Roman church, Paul again writes, "If we live, we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we belong to God." We belong to the Lord. Every time I think of that Bible verse and the truth that Paul must have been living out of to write those words, I admire his fearlessness and go, I want to be that way, God, before you, so that I could say something as powerful as the truth of that verse. What would it really mean to know you at that depth, with that poignant sense of your palpable, real, in my life, eternal presence, so that alive or dead, it really wouldn't matter. I wouldn't have to ever be afraid because you've got life and you've got death in your hands, and everything is held by you and belongs to you. No knock at the door, no shuddering plane or turbulence could scare me. Imagine how close you'd have to be to God all the time to live this. That kind of faith is an unshakable faith. That is not foxhole, circumstantially based, laughing at God faith. I want it with all my heart, and even though I want it with all my heart, I do the opposite, and I joke around with my faith and with God. I forget His presence again and again, way more than I remember God's presence. I ignore or I cease to remember who God is, and I trivialize God in all kinds of ways. And Regina Spektor gets at some of those ways in some of her lyrics as well. But God can be funny, she writes, at a cocktail party when listening to a good God-themed joke. Who writes like that? It's just great writing. At a cocktail party when listening to a good God-themed joke, or when the crazies say He hates us, and they get so red in the head you think they're about to choke, God can be funny. And then she really digs at what she sees in churches and people of faith. God can be funny when told He'll give you money if you just pray the right way, and when presented like a genie who does magic like Houdini or grants wishes like Jiminy Cricket and Santa Claus. God can be so hilarious. Ha ha. She's right. I don't think we have any idea how much we disrespect God when we treat God that way. We can ignore and turn our backs on God, not only through the whens of when we come to Him, but also through the hows of how we come to Him. God cannot be reduced or trivialized. God is not able to be made into a genie or a joke or a part-time life support system. Break glass when necessary. To do that is to be idolatrous, sort of one of the big, number one, human frailty sin things in the Bible. And I do it all the time. And when we do it all the time, collectively, we open up and provide all kinds of material for the Regina Spektors of the world to write about people of faith.